Okay, so to begin with, we're going to look at aggregate supply. So aggregate just means total. It just means adding up all of the supply of everything in an economy. So that's what aggregate supply is. It's the total of all planned production for the economy. Now, it's important that this planned aspect is important, and we'll see why later. But that's what aggregate supply is. It's the total planned production for an economy. And the long run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line that represents the real output of goods and services after full adjustment has occurred. So after everything in the economy has adjusted, that's what the long run is. Then we have our long run aggregate supply curve if there's been a sufficient amount of time for everything in the economy to adjust to whatever shocks there might have been, whether they were shocks to demand or supply. So that's long run aggregate supply. And what it represents is it represents the level of real GDP in the economy under conditions of something called full employment, which we've already talked about. Recall back a few chapters ago to that concept of full employment. It doesn't mean everybody's employed and there's no unemployment. It just means that there's the normal sort of long-run level of unemployment coming from frictional and structural unemployment only. There's no cyclical unemployment, right, when there's full unemployment. So recall those things. And another way to think about it is that the economy is on its production possibilities curve. So we're kind of in full gear, right? The economy is operating nice and smoothly when we're talking about long run aggregate supply. Okay, so relating long run aggregate supply back to our PPC, this is what it might look like, right? We've got our PPC, we've got long run aggregate supply. Now, let's think about why it's vertical, right? If we go back one second, the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical. So it's that purple curve on the right-hand side graph. Why is it vertical, right? Well, basically, input prices have fully adjusted to changes in output prices. So the prices of raw materials and intermediate goods have made a full adjustment to the prices that the firms in the economy are charging for their output. And so when this happens, when that adjustment has taken place, suppliers have no incentive to increase their output. They're kind of like in an equilibrium in a sense, right? There's no incentive to further increase their output. And then furthermore, unemployment is at the natural rate. We have full employment in the economy. And the long run aggregate supply curve is solely determined by the resources in the economy. So in other words, by endowments and technology, right? The existing resources in the economy. What can those resources produce? If we're fully utilizing those resources, then we have long run aggregate supply. And so the reason it's vertical is because the quantity supplied or the amount supplied by firms in the economy, it does not depend on the price level. So it's independent of the price level. So the price level might go up, it might go down, but long run aggregate supply stays exactly the same. And in this case, it's $18 trillion per year. Okay, so going back a couple chapters to the chapter on inflation, recall the concept of base year dollars. So it's anytime we express the value of something in terms of current prices in the base year, prices in the base year. I'm sorry, not current prices, but prices in the base year. So remember that concept from a few chapters ago. Now, endowments, you might have been wondering what endowments are. It's basically just the various resources that an economy has at its disposal, and it includes both, physical resources like machines and equipment and factories, But it also includes human resources like ingenuity and management skills, right? Things that are learned, that aren't tangible, they're sort of up here in our brains, right? So that's what we mean by endowments. It's just the resources that an economy has at its disposal. Now, we saw what economic growth looked like in our PPC model. What does it look like now with long-run aggregate supply? Pretty straightforward. It's just like, it's almost exactly like the supply curve we learned about in Chapter 3 in our supply and demand model, where when supply increases, it shifts to the right. Same thing here. So when there's economic growth, it's represented as a shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Now, the growth could be coming from growth in the population. It could be coming from increase in the labor force participation rate. So more people are getting out there and trying to find jobs. It could come from an increase in the stock of capital. So the amount of machinery and factories and equipment that we have. It can also come from improvements in technology, right? So recall that technology doesn't mean computers and electronics. It has sort of a broader definition in economics. It means technology in economics is the knowledge of how to produce things. So if there's an improvement in technology, there's an improvement in the knowledge of how to produce things. And so we can produce things more efficiently, and that leads to economic growth. So these are the things that can lead an economy to grow. And going back to our PPC and our long-run aggregate supply, comparing what economic growth looks like in the two models, this is what they look like, right? We can also think about plotting on a graph the long-run growth path, right? So plotting real GDP over time, and typically it slowly increases over time. So if we plotted the GDP, real GDP for certain years and connected the dots with a line, it would generally be sloping upward, and that's what we refer to as the long-run real GDP growth path. Okay, so that's what you're seeing here: full employment, real GDP on the y-axis, and time or years on the x-axis. So over time, our economy here in the U.S. typically grows at a pretty steady rate. So let's think about an international real-life example regarding long-run aggregate supply. So China's long string of rightward shifts in long-run aggregate supply curves since 1978 have allowed it to increase its economy, to expand at an average annual rate of over 9.5%, which is huge. The United States economy, if you look at its long-run historic average, is somewhere in the ballpark of 2 to 3% annually. So China is kicking our butts in terms of economic growth. And so what this means is that their long-run aggregate supply curve has been shifting rightward at an average pace of more than 9.5% per year, which is pretty remarkable.